As soon as we understand the other as a pure, unprovoked aggressor and see ourselves as the pure victims of that person's aggression, that is the moment when they likely see us in exactly the same terms. This, as he argues, reciprocal structure of human conflict is fundamental and irreducible because the nature of the conflict is always structured in this way. So why do we always think when we are engaged in some kind of aggressive activity that we are the victims, we're the ones being attacked, and we're merely defending ourselves? If you look around the world, as well as perhaps at your own, online life in particular, you'll find many, many examples of this. We might think here of the conflict that has shaken the world between Russia and Ukraine. Now, obviously, the standard framing of this conflict in the West is that Vladimir Putin is engaged in this unprovoked aggression against this smaller and weaker neighbor, right? However, if you actually look into Putin's own statements on the subject, he sees himself as engaged in an entirely defensive activity. Now, we might say that he's merely being cynical, but my sense is if you look at the history of his statements, he is actually quite obsessed with the idea that he is the victim of the West, right? And that I think he truly believes that he is. I don't think this is merely a kind of cynical rhetorical appeal. I think he truly believes this, that he is fundamentally in a defensive posture, and his actions can be justified in those terms. And there is a rational argument to be made that there is something to this, and a number of international relations scholars have made this argument and have largely been regarded as dangerous apologists for Putin. So what that tells us is merely what side we're on in this particular conflict, right? But there's only so much we can learn from that perspective, right? From the perspective of one participant in a conflict, or one, a member of one rival faction in a conflict, and this is a key insight of René Girard, would always see their own position as that of the victim who is merely fighting back to protect their legitimate interests against an unreasonable aggressor, right? And so the point here is that in any conflict, Girard would argue, the belief on the part of both participants that they are not a sort of unmoved mover of the conflict. In other words, they are not the primary aggressor. Instead, their belief is always going to be that they are in a defensive posture and justifiably protecting themselves against someone else's aggression. So this symmetry, right, of conflicting sides is a universal phenomenon we can see. We can see it in the relationship between the two major parties in the United States. We can also see it in, all kinds of small and larger scale social media conflicts we've probably been witness to, right? That each side will consider itself the victim and the other side the aggressor, but of course the other side also believes that. So for Girard, this reality is simply a function of the nature of all human conflict itself, which he argues is always based on a kind of reflective reciprocity, where any aggression or any violence or hostility that I engage in is always, to some extent, a mimetic reciprocal response to that of the person I'm in conflict with. And these simply feed off of and play off of each other, thus causing the conflict to escalate. But in general, it's very hard to identify a clear moment at which this process of escalating reciprocity began. And so the result is simply that we become most similar to each other precisely at the moment we see each other as, most different, right? Just at the moment, as soon as we understand the other as a pure, unprovoked aggressor and see ourselves as the pure victims of that person's aggression, that is the moment when they likely see us in exactly the same terms. And so this, as he argues, reciprocal structure of human conflict is fundamental and irreducible, right? It's not, we can't really trace this back to the origin because the nature of the conflict is always structured in this way. Girard sees in aspects of the Christian message the only viable response to this potentiality for conflict. For instance, we think here of the notion of turning the other cheek, where, the response the ethical response when immersed in this kind of conflict must always be to unilaterally surrender, it would seem, which is obviously, given the psychology I just laid out, not an appealing. It's in fact the most sort of counterintuitive and sort of radically, sort of unappealing response to this kind of a situation. And nevertheless, it's in this type of attitude that Girard finds the kind of the most radical and profound implications of Christianity, right? Because it attempts to respond directly to this situation of spiraling conflict on ethical grounds. Now, as we know from Girard's other work, this differentiates it from historical institutions like the practice of sacrifice, which provides a kind of socially cohesive way of resolving conflict through, again, this kind of inoculating dose of ritualized violence, right? So, while dismantling the basis of this kind of means of conflict resolution, Christianity also introduces this new ethic, right? Which involves a kind of forcible recognition of the reality, right? Of the innocence of the other, but also of our sort of mutual culpability, of our collective culpability for the kinds of violence in which we find ourselves embroiled. And so the paradox, though, is that, just to conclude this point, is that this Christian ethic also has a perverse downside, which is that it takes away the conviction and the guilt of scapegoats, which offered one primary means of resolving conflict. But in asserting the innocence of scapegoats, it in fact provides a pretext for a new and often heightened mode of conflict, in which those in conflict not only see themselves as the victims of their rival who are justifiably retaliating against violence that's been committed against them, but may also see themselves as ethical agents who are engaged in the protection of innocent victims. And so this leads to a situation where, as Girard says several times, the only thing that can justify scapegoating is believing yourself to be the opponent of scapegoating, or believing yourself to be the protector of scapegoats, right? So, and of course, the history of Christianity itself is full of this, as we might note in relation to Christian anti-Semitism, right, where the belief that one has the position of protecting innocent victims, right, and of standing for the ultimate innocent victim, i.e. Christ, one actually engages in scapegoating against another group, right, who is blamed for this. And for Girard in the modern world, this idea emerges in all sorts of ways, where again, even as the primary mode of scapegoating that enabled sacrificial religion is dismantled, a new and perhaps more perverse mode of scapegoating emerges, where those who commit scapegoating believe themselves to be doing so in defense of other scapegoats who they regard as innocent.
Hey, what's up? If you enjoyed this video, take a second to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We publish videos like this several times a week. And also, if you're interested in studying the work of René Girard on your own, we made an awesome, totally free 18-page study guide that you can download at girardcourse.com. It's expertly curated. It's in a logical sequence that's going to help you master his entire body of work at your own pace. You can go ahead and get that at girardcourse.com. All right, that's all I got for you. Over and out.